Okay, so it looks like we're recording. Yeah, we're quite serendipitous that all this came together off the back of a few tweets a week or two ago. We've got some really interesting people on the line, and we're going to have a chat about organisational design and some of the things that are happening in that space that a few of us find interesting. I'll introduce myself first. My name's Andrew Blain. I'm from a company called Elaborate in Australia. I have interests in agility, lean, and lots of other things. I've done a fair bit of organ operating model design over the last 3 or 4 years, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. But yeah, I am really interested in some of the ideas of the people in this group and kind of seeing if there's a little bit of shared understanding to explore. I'll introduce Nigel Thurlow. Nigel?
Yep. I'll go ahead. Yeah, so as Andrew says, my name is Nigel. I'm the CEO of the Flow Consortium, which is really the organisation that's set up to lead thought into the flow system, which is something I'm the co-creator of, which looks heavily at organisational design through the eyes of distributed leadership. But prior to that, I've worked for this sort of company here and had quite a lot of involvement with Toyota over the years and a lot of different organizations in leading so-called lean and agile transformations, which I don't think exist, but we can discuss that in the conversation. And so I've had a little bit of a play with organizational design over the years. And of course, now the flow system, we sort of propose some ideas around organizational design. So we'll see how this conversation goes. And since Jade is the next person on my screen, I'm going to hand over to the guy called Jabe.
Hello, thank you, Nigel. Nice to meet you. My name is Jabe Bloom. I work at Red Hat in the Global Transformation Office. When I am not working at Red Hat, I am getting my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and what I study and what I try to apply is how do socio-technical systems transition from one state to another over extended periods of time. So projects that I work on, or projects that I think about, would be projects of significantly long duration, hundreds of years duration. And that project is inside of CMU is called transition design, and it tries to think about how we might move towards a more sustainable way of living on the planet, and what we might have to do to get that done. And then finally, how has design, including things like organizational design and service design, kind of put us in the place that we are right now in relationship to a sustainable way of living on the planet, and tries to redirect the practice of design to improve that. Sonya?
Thanks, Jabe. My name is Sonya Blignaut. I'm based in South Africa. Kind of wear 2 hats. I am part of Cognitive Edge. I see Dave is also, he's joined us. And then I also run a small consultancy in South Africa called More Beyond. I originally come from the natural sciences, so I studied meteorology. And I've been kind of playing in the field of organizational psychologists, I guess, in the last almost a decade. So a lot of the work that I do involves introducing OD practitioners and leaders across the organization to complexity theory and helping them kind of make sense of the impact of that. So to just talk a little bit about what Nigel spoke about as well, I've become really interested in the last year or two about seeing organizations as flow systems and what that means in terms of design. And I'm also very interested in the overlay of complexity and system psychodynamics. I know they also look at the world through socio-technical lenses. And what that means if we start looking at organizations as dynamic and not static systems that can be designed in a static way. So that's a little bit of from my side. Matthew.
Hi, thanks, Sonia. Hi, I'm Matthew Skelton. I'm the co-author of this book here, Team Topologies, which was published in September 2019 by IT Revolution, the home of books like DevOps Handbook and Accelerate and so on. With me on the call is Manuel Paes, who's the co-author. So we pulled together some ideas based on our experience, based on some quite extensive research and some case studies, looking at the ways in which organizations have been setting themselves up to enable a fast flow of change, specifically in the software delivery space. That's what we know well. So we kind of restricted the focus of the book to that. We might maybe talk a little bit later about how some organizations have actually started to apply the ideas outside of there. And so really key ideas in the book include kind of much better, much better definitions of how different parts of the organization can and should interact, and also making sure that we're setting things up so that we're expecting evolution. We're not trying to design a single static template. We're setting the expectation that we are going to change, and therefore making sure the organizations are expecting that and building that into how they think about the kind of relationships between different parts of the organization. Next, well, Manuel, you're next on my screen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Manuel. As Matthew mentioned, I'm co-author of the book, Team Topologies. Yeah, my background is in computer science for about 20 years. And just to add to what Matthew said, most of what's in the book came from our experience with clients. And there are a couple of things that we noticed when we're trying to help them. Well, the first things, typically they expected technology and tools to help their teams do better, but they often were not looking, as mentioned before, they were not looking at the organization as a flow system, as the, how's the flow impact different teams and how can we improve that. So often there were issues around how the teams were structured, how they communicate to each other. Those were the bottlenecks, not the real bottlenecks, not the smaller, tools and going faster at the team level. And then the other thing that Matthew alluded to is that we also saw it for the same organization, a structure that was working quite okay at some point in time could very well in 6 months, in 1 year, 2 years time, be actually already creating bottlenecks to flow again, because they did not have these tools to think about how they need to evolve. They just, okay, as people mentioned, we've done, agile organization or DevOps organization that helped a bit at that moment, but then in 1 year's time, it was not adequate anymore, and they were not actively thinking about how to evolve. So I guess the last one is Dave, last but not least.
Dave Snowden, I direct the Cynefin Center. I created the Cynefin framework 21 years ago. Just discovered it's 21 years old this October, which is a bit scary. But I've allowed it out to get drunk several times before it reached the legal age of drinking, right? And some people have tried to abuse it, but that's another matter, right? I'm currently, in terms of the context of this discussion, developing work we originally started with Jabe and others on the concept of scaffolding. Particularly the way that informal networks provide scaffolding to structure organizations. So dependent on which research you read, between 50% and 70% of learning in an organization comes from informal networks, which are never formal systems. I used to have problems with this on IBM because they wanted to make the informal formal, and I pointed out then the energy gradients changed, all right? So informal networks are rather like the fungi that live in soil, which act as a symbiosis to allow the plants to grow. But without dense informal networks, you haven't got the ability for the organization to connect in novel or unexpected ways. Everything's been designed. So one of the big things I'm working on at the moment is extending the range of methods we already created for building and measuring informal network density. Yeah? And also for informal network learning, that includes further enhancing the concepts of crews, which are normal in military and civil contingency, where people occupy roles. So you don't have teams made up of individuals, you have teams made up of individuals who are trained in roles. And the advantage of crews is they last a very long period of time, and you can put individuals who've never worked together in them and they still work, and they work instantly. Right? So one of my ideas there is an organization might always need to have a pilot, but who the pilot is can change. So the concept of shifting from individual to collective leadership needs to be rethought. And it's not, and you'll gather by now, I think all the efforts to train individuals are, whereas they're not wrong, they're not going to make a big enough difference for me to spend time on it. So changing individuals does not produce sustainable, scalable change. Yeah. Also, people with natural talent will replace them anyway. If you look at what's happening in political leadership in America at the moment, yeah, or the UK, the people with the talent are more or less excluded from the process. So, and the danger at the moment of disaster capitalism disrupting countries worldwide is very high. So we live in very dangerous times at the moment, yeah? And that's going to impact on organizations. Trying to make, for example, try and pretend that companies like Amazon are agile, I find quite hysterical, because they're brutal dictatorships. They're not remotely agile, right? This is kind of like retrospective coherence. So from a complexity point of view, how things connect is more important than what they are. What the identity structures, identity is not the same thing as individuals, yeah? And we need systems with very low energy gradients, because the lower the energy gradient, the faster the system can learn and adjust. And the more you put formal organizations in the place, the more you make the energy gradients more costly. So those are kind of like the areas I'm working in.
Excellent. So you mentioned that that Jabe and yourself and some others had started work on scaffolding. Maybe I'll hand over to Jabe for a little bit to talk about the origins of that concept and what meaning it has to you.
Well, I think Dave and I have worked in different ways on this topic, and I'll let Dave talk for himself. He started some of that discussion with Anne-Marie Pendleton. Yeah. Sorry, Dave?
You've never allowed me to talk for myself before. Is this some novel process we're going? Some of that conversation I think started about 2.5 years ago at a retreat at a cognitive edge retreat, and Anne-Marie Pendleton was involved in those conversations. I think kind of understanding scaffolding for me is partially about kind of understanding the way in which I had a talk I did a while ago about the difference between stability, plasticity, and ephemerality of design interventions. So that the idea being that designers really needed to think about what they were trying to do temporally. Like, is the thing I'm about to put into the world right now supposed to be permanent, supposed to be stable over a long period of time? Is it supposed to be plastic, capable of like bending and shaping itself to the environment? So kind of you want to be thinking about like brain plasticity, if you heard that word at this point. Or ephemeral, I'm making this intervention, but it's actually designed in a way that it's not meant to last. It's meant to push something or knock something over, and then it itself is not valuable after that kind of interventional moment, right? And so those to me were, in my mind, were the kind of the original versions of my ideas of scaffolding, of what I was interested in, and became the conversation about scaffolding, because it's trying to point out that not all design interventions are valuable as a permanent thing, or as conceived of being as permanent. And even worse, some interventions, if you over-invest in them, if you take something that you could have done ephemerally and you make it stable, it can cause problems instead of causing the right answer to come out, right? Or causing the intervention to be effective. And I think, that if you hear Dave's kind of high gradient, low gradient energy stuff,
that's a little bit what I'm pointing at as well, right? Like if you over invest in a particular intervention and you over stabilize it, then when it's no longer valuable, you have to figure out how to take it down. You have to figure out how to remove it. And, you know, just from a very simple observation about most organizations, it's easier to create an intervention, to create something in an organization than it is to remove it from the organization. It's very difficult in a lot of organizations to remove policies, to remove rules, and to remove structures. So it's easier to go one way than there is to go the other way. So just thinking through these interventions in that way is part of what I am interested in as far as expanding the discourse about what design does and how it works.
So to add to that a bit, all right, and I think we did this over 3 separate retreats, the one in Whistler where Jabe was at, then we went on in Snowdonia with Anne and developed a whole typology of constraints. And that's gone on further development since. For me, constraints was the missing component in complexity management. I mean, and after, there were 2 big things which happened this year. One is sorting out scaffolding, the other was sorting out the apparatic confused part of Cynefin. And now, from my point of view, it's all coherent enough we can put it together. It wasn't really before. There were kind of like inconsistencies, as Einstein famously said about quantum entanglement. There are too many inconsistencies to publish yet, all right? And that's overcome. For me, scaffolding is the only thing that you can create a degree of permanence around. But I say scaffolding could also be temporary. So bamboo scaffolding, for example, can be put apart and put back together again very quickly. But has a high training overhead, whereas steel scaffolding, again, can be assembled and deassembled, but isn't very flexible. Everything has to follow a certain form. So that's one kind of distinction. But then I think what I'm also interested in is the whole concept of symbiosis. And this has always been key for me for the last 30 years. All parasites start off as symbiotes. Yeah, and part of the problem we got with Ebola at the moment is it's starting to switch from being a parasite to being a symbiote, which means it's learning not to kill quite so many people. And when things learn not to kill quite so many people, yeah, sorry about that. When things learn not to kill so many people, that's when they're dangerous, but ultimately they become a symbiote. So I spend a lot of time looking, for example, at Portuguese men of war, which are a fascinating thing. I've never forgiven IBM. They didn't like the image, so they made the image from my center in IBM a jellyfish because they thought it looked better, and that missed the whole point, right? Because a Portuguese man of war is a series of coexisting separate identities which have learned to become completely codependent, yeah? And that produces something far more stable and resilient than a single species, right? And the concept of informal networks, they're also what we're working on now in organizational design and also in software design. It's a concept of creating scaffolding structures which can be entangled around points of coherence. So but what people do when they design teams is they design the endpoint. Yeah, and Team Topologies has got a great summary of that. It's going on the bookshelf behind me as opposed to the bookshelf to my left, which is good news, all right? It means I intend to refer to it again, all right? But what it does, it defines endpoints. It doesn't define starting conditions. What I think we're doing from a complexity point of view is we're saying how much can we structure and what's the nature of the structure? You know, what can we put in place? How can we define, how can we allow entanglement to be designed, not accidental? And what are the points of coherence around which we entangle? Now that's actually the essence of the next generation of SenseMaker, but it's also the next generation of organizational design because it allows contextually unique solutions to emerge and adapt. Yeah, but based on a coherent whole. And one of the big things I've just finished writing the sort of summary section on the EU Handbook on Crisis Management. There are 2 golden lessons there. I've got to find a third. I've only got 2. This is frustrating the hell out of me. I've got to find a third, right? But one is you coordinate in the center, you don't make decisions. In a crisis, the role of the center is to coordinate and not decide. Because if you make the decisions, you won't have the cognitive time to do the coordination and link. And also the dangers of hypocrisy of you getting it wrong go up. Yeah, so it's a high risk strategy. The other one is you actually communicate by engagement. So you don't communicate to people, you engage them in helping you understand the problem. Right? Now, and actually scaffolding is the third one, I think somehow, but I haven't found a way to phrase it yet. You put enough structure in place that the thing can start to migrate towards a coherent pattern, which means you can transcend the crisis and come out the other side. But you don't put so much structure in place that you're second guessing the solution. Yeah, because that won't become evident till longer. So for me, scaffolding is key. And I think I've now moved into a sort of fundamental typology, which is it an exto or is it an endoskeleton? That's kind of like the fundamental one. So an exoskeleton defines structure, and then you can have variation within. An endoskeleton gives stability, but then you can get massive variation around it. So insects have low variation, mammals have high variation. So that's one of the distinctions, right? I think the other thing which is key on scaffolding is, can it be designed or does it have to emerge? Now that's actually quite important. So one of the things Anne Pendleton, Julian does on this, and she took my concept of dark constraints and created the idea of dark scaffolding for extreme sports. So for extreme sports to exist, the whole body of practice has to emerge over 10 or 15 years. It can't be designed. All right, and there are certain types of organizations, Spotify would be a good example, yeah, where actually what Spotify did well was to put some very simple principles in place and allow a pattern to emerge. And that couldn't have been designed up front. In fact, it wouldn't have the strength if they didn't. And that would have only worked in a Swedish culture. It didn't work in New York. All right, so this concept of what scaffolding does, it allows you to provide a context-free structure in a context-specific world. Yeah, and for me, that was vital.
So I just have one more comment based on what Dave said. To me, one of the important things about what we're moving into, or what we're trying to achieve with kind of new forms of organizational design, adopting the kind of biological metaphors that Dave just used, is the move from viewing teams as autopoietic to viewing teams as symbiotic. Yeah. And the difference here is this, right? Autopoietic conceptions of kind of self-organization have to do with the way in which a team would be viewed as emerging from a construct or a structure as an individual thing that's not reacting to the other things emerging from the structure. It's just like the structure is meant to make a team happen, specific things happen, yeah, autopoietically. They can self-organize within constraints, but they're supposed to be only self-organizing within relation to the structure or the strategy of the organization, right? Symbiotic theory of organizational design would say, yes, that is happening, but also the teams need to be reacting to each other and evolving in ways that support and co-support themselves. So this move from autopoietic to symbiotic is a move towards a flow-based system where teams can reorganize not only around the strategy and underlying structure, but in relation to themselves, so that they have these dynamics of kind of linearity cross or flow across.
Flow-based system where you can control the entry into turbulence. So if you look at kayakers on a stream, they build little stone walls out into the stream that they can rest behind before they go at the next stage. And I think that's another good example of scaffolding. I've been building that, yeah. So you want the excitement of the torrent, but you don't want it all the time. Okay? And that's one of the things. And symbiosis works partly like that. It has stable and unstable elements in the way it works.
Agreed. Yeah.
And it's why Varela and Machar and Varela fell out, I think. Yeah, over this. Yeah. Because autopoietic was always a sort of theoretical construct rather than an observed reality. And I think the flow element is where they fell out. Certainly Krug got that wrong. Yeah.
So just let me ask you a question. Let's translate that into simple examples for business, because scaffolding is the thing I've been learning a lot more about since David introduced it to me. I mean, he mentioned about central coordination, distributed decision-making, which is the construct of distributed leadership. And then all the things that Jabe was saying about teams, I fully support and agree with. And I also sort of see scaffolding as a temporary measure or some sort of enabling constraint that comes in that can be imposed, but also very much so, just like agility and various other things like learning and mistakes is emergent. So patterns emerge to support an organization or the teams within an organization, just as we can impose some sort of temporary measure to help support the organization. But I just wondered if you got a sort of a concrete sort of business example of sort of a piece of scaffolding that may be useful for listeners to understand how to apply this.
I need to qualify what you said first, because some scaffolding is designed to be temporary. Some scaffolding is designed to allow a permanent form to emerge around it.
Yes.
And the scaffolding remains, all right? So its form changes, but it remains. That's the qualification. Yeah. Informal network density is an example of scaffolding. So IBM, for example, when I studied it, had a 64-to-1 ratio between informal and formal communities. Yeah, 64-to-1, and that was only the ones using the virtual communities. Now, that was IBM's strength, because in an informal network, trust is automatic, whereas in a formal system, trust is not. Now, that's really important to understand, right? You can't create trust in a formal system. It takes a huge amount of effort. Whereas informal networks automatically have trust because people can not participate or participate. They're also not transparent. Transparency is the enemy of innovation and trust. It's the transparent. We're facing, we got a massive delay on an NHS project at the moment, which is vital. But we got 5 people who are worried about transparency. So they're trying to make other people take responsibility for the project because they know everything will be visible. And the CEO can't make a decision because everything she does is visible. So transparency is preventing innovation, and that's actually very common. So informal networks are a form of scaffolding. Yeah. The other thing is the temporary manager. So I'm going to give my data sciences example. I manage startups and close downs. So every time we bought a company, I got all the things the other general managers didn't want. And I could choose to build them or close them, because actually it's the same skill. Closing things is the same as building them. But the rule was after 2 years, I had to hand them over to one of the general managers if I built them, because the skills were different. Yeah. So, and the other thing is you weren't allowed to be a general manager until you'd done a year in sales, a year in production, a year in support, and hit your targets, because you didn't have the tacit knowledge to be a general manager without that experience. And it also, because you'd done it, people knew you did it, therefore they accepted what you did. Now, those are examples of highly structured scaffolding, which actually produce unpredictable but manageable results. Yeah.
You just described the Toyota management training that goes off because it takes 20 years to become a general manager. So you just described that eloquently.
It was 3 years if you were lucky and passed. And I was lucky and I closed a contract 3 hours before I was about to fail my target. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made it, all right? And after that, I never, ever was rude about salespeople again, because how the hell they survive when they can't pay the mortgage some months, I don't know, right?
So like an example I might use is an enterprise platform. And there's like 2 ways to think of an enterprise platform inside of an organization, right? How did it come to be? One is kind of like, let's go build it and they will come. And I think that's a very poor example of scaffolding, right? It's the opposite of what we're talking about, right? Like build a big thing and then force people to use it, right? Instead, you could think of it like the scaffolding might be a combination of like, we're going to create a team and a focus area and drive it as an attractor, as a pull system that's pulling people into it, right? And we're going to try to establish the platform via interaction with teams that actually have proved the value of the components already in the field. They're actually using it out there. And the way we're going to build it is we're going to pull components out of these pre-existing pieces. We're going to start forming a platform that's going to become the scaffold, because it's enough of a focus area now where the teams now don't see the platform as someplace our code goes to, but someplace that we work together. And it becomes a focal area for the teams to merge their ideas and their work together, and becomes a common space of collaboration that has now been scaffolded. Does that make sense? The difference between those two?
Yeah. That sounds vaguely value-based and customer-focused. I mean, what a terrible concept.
Yeah, no, so I think that the main thing to understand, right, is that it's not a paradox to say that we should only develop code for a customer and we should also make it eventually reusable. It's the eventually reusable. It's not. It has to start by being pulled by the customer, and then it can all of a sudden turn and say other teams can pull the code. And when they start pulling it, that's when it becomes a platform. And the scaffolding is giving a place for that activity to occur, for that pull of the cross-team concerns, the common concerns about data and functionality, the common concerns about effective pattern usage and ways of deploying the technology. All of that needs a space to occur in. And in a lot of organizations, there's just nowhere for that to happen. There's individual teams and there's central IT. There's nowhere for common work to occur. And that's part of the problem. And that's why you need something like a scaffold, just to say to people, there is a way in which you can work together. And that happens to be this platform.
That was a fantastic explanation, Jabe.
Nigel, I'm going to butt in quickly because I noticed that Jabe earlier was talking about, I think it was going to be 4 ways that teams need to organize, and there was strategy, structure, organizing around themselves, and I'm assuming you were going to talk about organizing between teams and the integration points between teams. I was going to get either Matt or Manuel to start talking about those integration points and what they've been doing in practice.
Thank you. So what we define in the Team Topologies book is, so we've got some different types of team, if you like, which is just ways of effectively the types of team in the Team Topologies book are really about collections of behavior and expectations. That's what they really are. There's some specific stuff that relates more to kind of software design and things, but really a team type is a set of expected behavior and focus for an entity as a team, as a kind of single entity. But because the magic occurs, if you like, in the interactions between parts of a system or parts of an ecosystem, then we also took some time to characterize different ways in which we think teams inside an organization should interact. And so we've got collaboration. So we specifically define that as 2 teams working together over a defined period to achieve a specific outcome. So it's not just kind of some looser definition of collaboration. It's with a very specific kind of goal in mind, usually around discovery of new stuff, whatever that means. We find ourselves in a new situation and we need to discover some things. Let's adopt a different way of interacting and be very conscious about it. The second one is X as a service. So simply kind of consuming an existing service or providing an existing service, which is pretty straightforward kind of conceptually. But actually we found that in so many organizations, so many teams don't think about it in those terms. They don't even know how to provide a service. They don't even know what consuming a service would even feel like. I don't just mean a technical service. I mean the whole service wrapper around it, what it feels like to interact with the people who are supposed to be providing that service. What does documentation look like? What's the lifetime expected evolution of that service? The whole conceptual service, if you like. And then the third kind of way of interacting that felt useful to describe was what we call facilitating. So we've got a team that's responsible for something, but they need something's not working or they need some help, and so we've got a team that's kind of giving them some temporary support. And that this team of which is acting in a kind of facilitating way then usually has experts, but they're not building anything on behalf of this primary team. They are mentoring or coaching or guiding in some way, and also listening. They are listening for what is missing. Have we got skills and capabilities missing in this team? Do we have skills and capabilities missing in the platform underneath? Do we have fundamentally the wrong understanding of what we're trying to do as an organization as a whole? They're there as a kind of sensing mechanism to detect, because they're working across multiple different primary teams. They're there as a sensing mechanism to say, let's listen out for what's going on actually in the organization. So, and in the book, we think, certainly in the field of kind of modern enterprise software delivery, that these are really the only three different ways that are really needed in terms of interaction. And I mean, that's at least two different ways. That's at least two ways more than most organizations have right now, which is just kind of muddling along and hoping it works out, right? So a little bit of definition around these, and it's about setting expectations for behavior and making it a first-class thing that we should have some mechanism of. It's effectively it's boundary spanning for the facilitating team. And that incredibly important kind of activity, which has been proven plenty of times with NASA failures and all sorts of stuff. We've got boundary spanning across multiple different kind of parts of the organization. We're actively expecting to listen and then provide some signals to do something, whatever's appropriate.
I'd just like to give an example, which I think also fits this idea of scaffolding. So in our training around team topologies, there's usually an exercise, specifically around organization charts. We're trying to highlight what Dave was talking about earlier, that it's the informal structures that bring value and the informal communication that needs to happen, versus looking at the org chart as dictating how people should communicate with nice lines and boxes. And so that exercise is quite good, because most people look at it and say, oh, right, we have this org chart, but in reality, when I think about some complicated project, it went very differently from what the org chart would suggest. But I had one person who replied, because we asked, okay, so how does it look at the organization? They said, well, we have two levels. We have the CEO, then we have the VPs, and underneath that is self-organized by the teams. And I thought that was a interesting way to say we have kind of a minimum structure in place, because there's compliance, and if you need to be able to legally respond to stock markets and stuff like that. But they were basically saying underneath that it's kind of open-ended, and that's why for them team topologies, for example, is quite interesting, because it allows them then to have structures within that kind of open layer, where they say, well, now we need more of these teams. We need perhaps another team that's going to help us gain some knowledge, or we need more of the platform services to allow us to go faster. So I think that's an interesting model, where you're saying we want to promote teams, self-organizing teams that can deliver faster, but at the same time, if we use some common patterns and ideas about what it is, how we are going to achieve these things we need to do, it brings a nice mix of flexibility and promoting informal structures and organization, while also having clarity on what they want to achieve.
There's another industrial example which is relevant here, which is Sipgate. They're one of my favorite companies in Dusseldorf. Came to them through Agile 42, and I don't think either Agile 42 or Sipgate understand each other, but that's a different matter. One of their main scaffoldings is breakfast. So they provide free breakfast for all their staff, and it's really good. In fact, they now have free lunch as well. So basically, the common eating actually provides a fundamental scaffolding around which the organization works. And they have, crashes within the organization. And they worked out the money, all right? The money they spent on organizational design consultants was considerably less than the money you'd spend on chefs. And therefore, they did the latter, not the former. Now, it seems to me that having a sort of, we're hierarchy here and below that we're not, is a mistake, because actually people need a hierarchy. I can give you loads of references on this. Yeah, people need to know where they sit in a hierarchy. It's not the only structure within an organization. Yeah, somebody has to be responsible for people, for paying conditions, etc. So that's one sort of function on there. But you can provide an awful lot of scaffolding with social spaces, yeah, and benefit, and then see what happens. Yeah, people overthink design. Yeah, we actually evolved as a social species where the campfire is probably one of the most important things. Right? It's quite interesting in our village at the moment. You know, we're all pissed off because they've stopped the Thursday clapping of NHS staff. So we all went out at 8 o'clock and everybody clapped. Well, we've all got to chatting with each other. I've met people in the street I didn't know existed because we move, and it's one of our social spaces. We're naturally social creatures, right? Now that's interesting. A ritual within a physical space creates connections which wouldn't otherwise exist. And I think that's the thing OD people never think about. They start with the OD, or they start with what they want things to be. And that's always a mistake. It's a fundamental error in complexity. You need to say, what can we do in the present? And let's see what happens. You don't need to say, this is the minute you say, we want to be this type of organization, we want to have this person, we have that. The minute you do that, you've just destroyed yourself. You've just condemned yourself to a cycle, a cyclical cycle of despair, hope, despair, hypocrisy, and then the whole thing starts again.
So I'm going to jump. Sorry, Sonya, go ahead.
No, Nigel, I just quickly wanted to comment on this idea of hierarchy, because I think something that I've seen too much of is almost a demonization of hierarchy. We've seen it's like we need to get rid of, we need to flatten the hierarchy. And one of my favorite complexity authors, Paul Sillier, he wrote an article specifically on hierarchy, and he speaks there about part of the fundamental adaptive capacity of a system is its ability to maintain adaptive hierarchies. And I've always found that notion really interesting, especially when you start thinking about flow and almost how do you create fluid organizations or organizations with fluid structures. And I think one of the key inhibitors here, and so I do a lot of work with OD and HR departments. And even when it comes to things like, these team typologies, etc., the policies and, things like how they remunerate, how they define roles, how status is defined in an organization, all of those things work together to keep these hierarchies rigid. So I don't have any answers for what that might look like. I think Dave's idea of trios, and I really loved what Jabe was saying in the beginning of plastic versus permanent or even ephemeral structures. I think we need to get rid of this notion or this idea that a hierarchy needs to be permanent unless we restructure, which happens way too often. So it's almost, how do we create fluid hierarchies? That is something that I'm really interested in.
So just a really quick, before Nigel jumps in, there's actually a concept for what you're describing. It's called heterarchies, and a heterarchy is a hierarchy that responds directly to contextual input. So it is not hierarchical until it's challenged, and then it becomes a hierarchy. That's what a heterarchy does. Just for fun.
There's good examples on that. If you look at the way the hordes formed, I spent about 2 or 3 years reading everything I could on Genghis Khan and the like. So that's an adaptive hierarchy. You've got families and tribes and hordes, and depends on the context, they assemble in different ways. So there's always a hierarchy, but the hierarchy is different based on context.
So I'm going to try and jump on.
Hierarchies allow you to optimize transparency. Because if you have a hierarchy, you can give somebody in hierarchy responsibility to do something without accountability. That allows for innovation. If you have complete self-organization, everything has to be transparent, so nobody will do anything risky. Sorry, Nigel.
No, it's fine, because there's so many different interesting points, and I'm trying to sort of visualize it and contextualize it for business from that point of view. And even jumping back to what Matthew and Manuel was saying about boundary spanners, because boundary spanning is a major feature for the distributed leadership model we've sort of talked about in the flow system. And really, I wrote a piece on this recently because I see this as the way of giving purpose to that middle management layer. If we come back just to the basic structures within an organization, you've got your upper echelons of the executives who are detached and non-participatory, and we've got the middle management that are frightened to death at what the transparency that gets told to these folks here, so they suppress what's happening down here, which stops all the innovation, the self-organization, the organic nature of that. And some of the comments that you were describing sort of describe something like a fully self-organizing organization, which is a fantastic concept. But the problem with organizations and the hierarchies in organizations, they want real rigid confirmed structure, and the HR folks are very much in that camp. And I think Cotter sort of talked about this a little bit in what he used to call his dual operating system, where you've got the hierarchy to stop the lunatics running the asylum, but then this sort of multi-team system that's self-organized and reorganized organically depending upon the emergent needs and what occurred. But coming back to basic organizational design, and Andrew and I were talking about this before the call started, or before we started recording, is that there's a few basic concepts here. We got somebody who wants something, typically the people who pay you money, the generators of revenue, or the where revenue comes from. That tends to be called the customer. And then you've got these other folks which tend to be called users or stakeholders, which don't actually pay for the things they consume or use. They have an influence on it, but they are the sort of internal stakeholders and typically users of systems or products. It doesn't have to be IT systems here. We're just talking about the consumers of something. We in the flow system call this value. I know it's a crazy concept, but we call this value, and value, to be valued, has to be valuable. So there has to be a perception of what you're delivering is valuable. And so this is where the whole customer first concept comes from. And then the organization needs to organize itself in a way that optimizes the delivery of what people perceive as value, be that internal users and stakeholders or external customers. And this is the challenge we're trying to solve here. So when we start to look at distributed leadership, we want that centralized coordination, those enabling constraints that give us purpose and focus as to what we're directing, the direction we're going in. But then you need the teams to organize in a way that allows them to deliver that value. But if we don't give those middle management a functional role, which is functional leadership, a purpose, which is boundary spanning, then that tends to reduce the ability of that organization. And listening to Manuel and Matthew about the teamologies and the different typologies of teams, for those to be able to organize in the way they want to, and actually take self-organization beyond the sort of Scrum guide notion of this, which is, 6 or 7 or 8 people sort of self-organizing in a way, or 3 to 9 to give the correct quote. We're now saying that teams can self-organize across teams. So we're talking about self-organizing multi-team systems. And then when you have a multi-team system organization, the boundary spanning functional role becomes absolutely crucial to allow those multi-team systems to have some form of scaffolding to be able to function effectively. So there's a lot of interesting points I was trying to pull together in my head there.
Yeah, a lot of the work that we've been doing lately, Nigel, has been about putting the people with the political context, the knowledge of the technical or architectural constraints, the knowledge of the physical constraints of the environment, the social constraints of the environment, into a process where they learn about the principles of modern organizational design, but then actually go through a process of designing their own system. So it's basically a design studio with iterative approaches and a modified version of Dave's ritual descent process that sort of sits there to enable them to have some nice debate, some healthy debate about each other's ideas. But yeah, it's about putting the power to do op model and org design back in the hands of the people who actually know what's going on.
Funny that the people who know what they need to do and how to do it, and giving them the power to be able to organize that. So another crazy notion. Because we've got some people who study anthropology and sociology and human beings on the call, one of the things that I've focused on a lot, and I'm not in that category of deep expertise, but one of the things I've focused on a lot is human factors, human behaviors. Because one of the things we find within organizations is the behaviors of those that have reached their pinnacle of leadership, whether you subscribe to the Peter principle or not, the level of their incompetence, they become, their behavior starts to fall into that command and control category, which is, I've reached a level of power and prestige in the organization. I am not going to cede that power and prestige and allow those that are under me to be able to make decisions in this distributed leadership model and self-organize and reorganize in a fluid way to deliver the value to a customer. And so I'm interested what the group's opinions are and actually trying to correct those behaviors, because behaviors can be emergent, but there are ways we can structure with scaffolding and activity to sort of guide behavior, and Toyota the Andon Cord is an example of that. But I'm interested in what everybody's thoughts are about how we correct the behaviors, because all the ideas we're talking about are incredibly valuable and fantastic. But while ever we have certain behaviors entrenched within an organization and we can't break that behavioral cycle, then a lot of these ideas won't gain traction.
So I think like one of the things that I've tried to figure out how to best say this in the past on Twitter, and I haven't figured it out quite yet. But the book that I'm most pissed about not having written, without claiming that I could have written it, is the Team Topologies book. It's such a great book to read. I really enjoy it quite a bit. But part of the reason I want to like do a good version, bad version of what could happen with that book, right? The good version of it is something like critical anthropology or critical ethnography. And what that theory is based in is the idea that groups of people will be surveyed by governments, and there's no way that's going to stop. But one of the things that ethnographers and anthropologists could do would be to teach those people how to express themselves about themselves in ways that they can be seen by that government appropriately, right? I think the good version of the Team Topologies book is that people in organizations will use it to self-organize within actual constraints, as opposed to like, just go self-organize and figure it out. Like it'll naturally emerge from the planet will make it all right, or some crap like that, right? Instead, we've got a set of language and techniques and theories about how people can think about organizational design that's been boiled down well enough that people can read it and people could use it to actually express how they would like themselves to be observed as an organized group in language that would make sense to corporate, right? To corporate players. The bad version of it would be that the big five pick up the Team Topology stuff, do a little bit of, whitewashing of it and rename some of the theories, and then offer to sell people workshops around developing their organizations, right? I think that like the difference between these two versions where something like Team Topologies allows the concept of self-organization to actually emerge within real constraints as opposed to vague hippie promises. That is the promise to me of something like this. And that's the thing that I think we really need to get to, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think the bad version is inevitable. So
yeah, I'd agree.
We need to design with that constraint in mind.
One of the things that we did already is to have a page on our website called certification, and then make it super clear that we don't offer certification. And if anyone spots anyone offering certification, then they can send us in our direction.
You need to learn the penicillin lesson. So penicillin, they refused to patent it, so it would be freely available for humanity, and then an American company patented it and made all the money. So I would be careful. It's why we just trademark Cynefin, just to stop anybody else doing it. Right.
So we might do something like that.
We're not sophisticated enough for understanding of behavior. I mean, I've been playing around with different types of behavior. So you get narcissism, which is very common in large organizations. Yeah. And now at a national level, which it never has been before. I mean, that's the crazy thing about a modern world. And that's got to be something to do with connectivity has made narcissism possible. that before connectivity, there were too many buffers for it to get to a political state. You've got deviance, you've got cynicism. Yeah, you've got reverse paternalism, where people in the network think they know better than the CEO, and they may do, right? All of these have positive and negative aspects. And I think there's a really, I've got a blog, Half Information, on this, which is kind of like a typology of behavioral characteristics. Because one of the things I always said is the cynics are the ones who care. So if you've got cynics in the organization, you should be bloody grateful, because you're getting a feedback loop. Yeah, and you should really, really tell yourself off, because you've allowed them to get to the point where that's how they feel, right? And anybody who, I mean, we're doing some potential work with one of the big farmers at the moment, and I still remember I did the first merger and acquisition work with them 20 years ago, and now we're about to do it again. And I went to Leanne Letchley, which tells you who it was actually, and basically said, I think you should fire these people. And he said, why? They're all the people who are positive about the merger. And I said, that's why you should fire them. Because the people who care about the company are carrying on doing the jobs. These guys are just playing politics. And we've looked into this, right? They've all worked out what you want to hear, and they're feeding it to you constantly, and they're in your ear all the time. And you're about to promote them to jobs they can't cope with, yeah? Yeah, the ones you want to listen to are the ones who don't agree with you. And that was when we set up a virtual community where he could go and talk with people without anybody knowing it was him.
Dave,
and that was very effective.
What you've just said is incredibly true. The narcissistic tendencies, the fact that all the what they used to call the yes men back in the day, all the people agreeing with those narcissistic leaders, and they're ignoring and subverting and actually removing. And I've experienced recently the continuous firing of senior people, director or executive level, who have not agreed with the narcissistic leadership. So this is a real problem in industry today.
But I think here we also need to just, consider the system that enables that behavior. Because, it's interesting. I've seen so many times there might be a really problematic person, whether on a team or on an exco, might be the narcissist. You get rid of that person and somebody else just takes up that role again. And so yes, and I think, this is why I find the world of system psychodynamics so interesting, because there's a really interesting interplay also between the constraints that's in place and that's held, and how people take up particular roles and the dynamics between people. And I think this is something that we have, and the OD community in general have neglected. They focus so much on the individual, and they forget about the system that co-creates that behavior in it, and that in a way, keeps it in place.
I think like one of my very favorite stories, really quickly, I met this man who was a Toyota sensei and was working in an American corporation. He said, I want to say something. You seem like a sharp kid, so I want to tell you something. When I was a sensei in Toyota, when we got a new manager, the new manager would show up, and what would happen would be that the new manager would start doing the Toyota way. In the United States, when I get a new manager, they change everything every 3 years. And it's because they think they've been hired to change something, and they don't have any respect for any form of overarching constraint or system. So the only way they can express their value is by changing things. And he said, I've seen more value destroyed by managers trying to prove that they've done something than just simply doing the work of management.
Well, we've unfortunately come to the end of the 1 hour time box. I'm happy to keep chatting about this stuff if people are available, but I think I probably should pause the recording now. I'd just like to say a big thanks to everyone. That was a really fascinating conversation that went in all sorts of very cool directions. I really appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks for organizing it, Andrew.
Thank you for having us. Yep. I wish we had heard Matt and the other authors a little bit more. I apologize if I talk too much. That's a habit of mine.
I think we need a second session. So Andrew, I think that's the next task for you to add to your backlog.
Another one.
All right, we'll do. What I'll do is I'll save this recording and send it out to everyone so you can distribute it. And yeah, I'll stop it now. But thanks again.
Okay. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andy.